The most important questions about AI shouldn't be how to prompt or how AI hallucinates. They should be about us.
Who shapes these systems? What do we want to become together? What kind of world are we weaving?
Welcome to Between Us and the Machine
with Margot van Brakel
and Juliette McDowell.
Don't forget to subscribe.
Welcome. Would you go to a doctor that's misdiagnosing their patients 22% of the time? Probably not. But according to a Burns and Wilcox report, that's exactly what's happening. Today's AI models are generating severely harmful clinical recommendations in more than 1 in 5 medical cases. And the worst performers, wrong 40 times out of 100. And a separate Stanford and Harvard study found that the same AI is already embedded in everyday care, flagging patients, reading mammograms, drafting notes, chatting directly with patients. All of this with almost no standardized oversight, no accountability frameworks, and no agreed upon way to even measure harm. The governance is already behind. And so our question today is, does it have to be? And did medicine already build the answer?
Our guest today is Alice Liu, a responsible AI and digital health specialist with a computer science degree, an MBA from Yale, and a career that spans Cisco, the World Bank, health NGOs, and over 20 low and middle income countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. She has spent decades at the intersection of technology, development, and business. And she's increasingly focused on ensuring that AI governance and deployment is more inclusive, participatory, and grounded in lessons from the past. Alice, very welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Alice, the intersection you work in, health ethics and governance, isn't exactly something people stumble into by accident. How did you end up here?
Okay, well, this is, I'll try and keep this story short because I've gone through a couple of pivots. So as you mentioned, I have a computer science undergraduate degree and was going through that career. And at the end of the dot-com boom, so I'm dating myself, I was really not sure what I wanted to do. I knew I didn't want to just keep going up the software engineering ladder. I was already kind of on the management side of things because I had been frustrated with management. And meanwhile, I had a vacation the previous year to Africa, and that got me thinking because I hadn't really learned much about the culture, the economy. It was a safari, so I mean, of course, it focused on the wildlife. But so I'll just keep it short. One thing led to another, and I learned about the term the digital divide, and that even an early program at Hewlett Packard called what was it called? It was called the E-Inclusion Group. Mm-hmm. And they were doing what seemed like crazy things like taking surplus shipping containers and making a cyber cafe in the Amazon jungle. And those of us who actually have worked in health now know that's actually very common to take surplus shipping containers and make buildings out of them. But that during that time period, I found the person who was speaking about this. She had her MBA from Stanford. I got the nerve to talk to her. I was new to networking and decided to get my MBA to explore this path. And after graduation, moved to DC and just kept on networking and got my first job in international development. And the that was let's see now, that was in 2005. And that was sort of the beginning of the ICT for D field, or we would say information and communication technology for development. The early days, where some of the pioneers of that were, guys out in the middle of the desert waiting for the satellite to come over so they could send a message. I mean, that some people were much earlier than myself. By the time I joined or started in this field in 2005, there were cyber cafes and being built, and the iHub in Nairobi was probably getting started. I did my summer internship at Busy Internet in Accra, Ghana. So anyway, so I fell into kind of general ICT for D, if you will, based on the organization's projects, and then started focusing more on mobile money and ICT for agriculture, and then fell into digital health, which is where I've been mostly. And um, it was around 2016, and I'm being a technologist, I follow tech, all along, as well as transit international development. But it's in 2016 when there was a New York Times article about Google Translate and how it got really good because they started adopting or applying neural networks and deep learning. That I realized, okay, I've been hearing about AI for forever, actually, since college. But here, finally, it's beyond just, figuring out what ads to send you, right? Beyond just optimizing your social media feeds. If it's actually getting better and better at translation, this seemed like this was becoming real, right? This was perhaps even becoming, as smart as a human, right? So then I just started paying more attention to what was going on in AI, and then heard about the harms that have been happening, like the Google Photos error that labeled African Americans, Haitian Americans as gorillas, right? I mean, very, very shocking and unfortunate errors like that. And then, of course, worse, misidentifying faces, African faces, African American faces as criminals. And these were Congress people who were misidentified in this way. Um, so I sought to work more in this responsible AI space, and that's really where I want to focus my energies these days.
Wow, so that's quite a journey. Now let's make sure our listeners are with us with what we mean with health ethics infrastructure. Institutional review boards, IRBs, bioethics frameworks, equity research standards. What did it actually take to build that, and how long did it take?
Yes, I'm glad that we can start with the history, because we titled this episode, what would Hippocrates do? Can we use medical ethics as a roadmap for AI governance? And it's really interesting when you explore this. And I'm just exploring this myself. I don't have a degree in biomedical ethics, but if we go back, it turns out that this is 400 BC. There was sort of a similar environment that we have today in AI, except it was a completely unregulated medical marketplace, if you want to call it that. They had traveling healers and charlatans and priests claiming they had divine cures, and no way for people to tell a difference. So that's what was the instigated, you could say, this famous Hippocratic oath. Um, and there are other texts on this as well. Ancient Indian, Chinese, and Islamic medical texts also exploring these their own ethical frameworks around the practitioner's duty to the patient. Do no harm, and then of course the field has matured since then. I mean, we have had similar kind of the issue of charlatans and snake oil medicine in the early 19th century or even earlier. The British Medical Association was founded in 1832. There's a landmark book by Thomas Percival on medical ethics in 1803. And then the American Medical Association had its first code of ethics in 1847. So these policies and the concept of ethical practice were emerging, but still guidelines, right? Still self-policing. So it was the atrocities of the 20th century that actually forced real attention to this with actual force of law, you could say. We all have some idea from our learning, from our education about the Nuremberg trials after World War II. Um, it was a Nuremberg Code in 1947 that established voluntary informed consent because of the Nazi experiments on the concentration camp and other prisoners, the horrific experiments they did. The U.S. has had a very sad and horrific history as well. The Tuskegee experiment on 399 black men in Alabama, where they deliberately denied treatment for syphilis for 40 years, from 1932 to 1972. And this was a study by the U.S. Public Health Service, the U.S. government. Um, and when that came to light, that just, of course, horrified. There was public outrage. So Congress acted, and there's a series. And I don't know. I know this may get a little bit um, kind of academic, but there was the National Research Act of 1974 that mandated the institutional review boards for the first time. That's when the IRBs started. Then there was the quote unquote the Belmont Report in 1979 that gave the system its ethical foundation, the respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And then the IRB system was standardized across federal agencies in 1991. So there was, as you may or may not know, the U.S. has various federal agencies. They have different responsibilities. Sometimes it appears overlapping, and it can still be a bit confusing. And today, where the jurisdiction lies. Data privacy protections came in with the HIPAA laws in 1996, and these practices guidelines are still being updated today. Other atrocities happened. If you want to, maybe that's a bit dramatic to say, but there's another history of the forced sterilizations in the U.S. related to eugenics. We had the thalidomide disaster. If people don't know that history, that was about that drug that was given to pregnant women, and it led to babies born with deformities. This was in the 1950s and 60s. And we had the AIDS crisis that also pushed the issue of research and prejudice even further. So it's interesting that all of these ethical practices, these attempts at introducing ethical research, informed consent, it came out of these scandals, these not from foresight, not from thinking ahead. So this is where we are now with AI, right? We are anticipating harms. Actually, we have experienced some harms, and we want to institute ethical frameworks and policies and governance before it's even worse. So that's kind of how it all ties together.
Yeah, it makes so much sense to learn from the past and to do it better moving forward. But yeah, history tells us that it's good to put awareness on that. So yeah, that's what this conversation obviously is also contributing to. So Alice, you've worked in more than 20 low and middle income countries, and the communities most harmed by failures in the health research were often the same communities used as test subjects without consent. Now, is AI repeating this pattern?
There have been some instances, and let's say explicit, and maybe, or you could say overt or covert. There may be others that we don't know about, but for instance, in the AI data supply chain, we have the case of, WorldCoin, which was gathering biometric data, specifically iris scans, our eyes. um, in several of the low and middle income countries in Ghana, Kenya, Sudan, Zimbabwe, um, other countries. I forget all of them, but um, they were not transparent about how the scans would be used, and they failed to deliver on promised payments. I'm trying to remember the details, like if it was an exchange for your iris scanner was part of, I think it might have been linked to a cryptocurrency, but I'd have to look that up. Um, then what's come to light also over the past several years is the um, use of data workers in Kenya, Venezuela, other countries um, to train and label the data um, for AI models, and they've had to look at very disturbing content, violent content, sexual violence, child sexual abuse material, which is known as CSAM. And they weren't told when they were hired exactly the nature of what they would be doing.
Yeah.
And they were paid low wages and provided little mental health support. So that's, they were exploited in another way, right? They were harmed in another way, not necessarily in the actual case of, medical interventions, but in the act of being a part of this AI data supply chain. So yes, there are issues happening now, and probably others that we have not uncovered yet.
Yeah, thank you. And before you mentioned the ethics having been developed over, I think you kind of spanned it over 100 years, right? And AI is moving, the AI technology is moving faster than the health technology ever did. So, does this make the case for borrowing the infrastructure a little bit more urgent or pressing? Or does it, give permission in a way because it's happening so quickly? People think, I could just skip it. We need to implement this.
I really hope no one is thinking of skipping it. I have not heard of anyone in the medical field that is thinking of skipping it. Health is literally life and death. And as we've seen from the history, you know, even medical practitioners and researchers can act unethically. They may not have thought of it as unethical at the time. Although in the Nazi war criminal case, that maybe they did realize no, they were doing some things they
Just a
wouldn't
little
normally
different.
do. Yeah, so yeah, there are medical professionals thinking very hard about this. There have actually been several recent papers in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the New England Journal of Medicine, or NEJM, that propose that the paradigm of training, certifying, and overseeing clinicians could be applied to clinical AI systems. You've got how we train human intelligent beings. Well, let's train clinical AI entities, if you will. And they present the analog process of how we train humans, and here's how we would apply it to a clinical AI system. And it's something I've been thinking about. I actually proposed in a course I took a couple of years ago about that eventually I think uh, AI developers in health may need to become licensed, just like physicians, nurses are have to be licensed. And they were kind of shocked, right? The people in the course are kind of shocked. There's like too many AI developers. I said, well, I could do a quick Google search. There's at least 1 million doctors in the US. That's just the US. I think we can do the same for 1 million software engineers developing, medical AI solutions. So these papers are basically, also raising that same question. Can we run through a licensing scheme for these solutions? So I think it's worth exploring. But it's kind of ironic, right? There, as I mentioned before, we've got the parallels of what Hippocrates was trying to solve for to what we are trying to solve for with AI, right? An unregulated marketplace, actors making extravagant claims, no way for the public to distinguish trustworthy from untrustworthy outputs, let's call it, and vulnerable people at risk from the power imbalance, the knowledge or information asymmetries. So, maybe he was foreseeing the need for AI governance, but just applying it to health.
So you mentioned actually some of the pieces of the health ethics infrastructure, right? So I think that's a really what you mentioned about licensing. That's I think a really good idea. What other what other things can we draw from uh, that's really needed urgently by AI governance?
Well, I think we can borrow some aspects of the IRB process, which is basically prior review before deployment. Um, as again, we learned that from the history of medicine that reviewing harms after the fact is not what we want to do, right? The harm's already happened for years and decades. So we need to really study and scrutinize the research. That's what we do with IRBs, right? We're scrutinizing the research that involves human subjects before it proceeds, before it's allowed to proceed. And before we want to do this beforehand and not after someone gets hurt. And right now AI's default is the opposite: deploy fast and fix problems later. And that may be okay for something rather innocuous like an ad, right? Feeding you the right ads, optimizing your social media feed, even sending you into a traffic jam instead of finding a new route for you, right? That's not, let's say, okay, you're delayed by 20 minutes or so. That's in comparison to AI for health. Uh, Obviously, this is life and death. So it needs a higher level of scrutiny. It needs precautions. A second one is the idea of adverse events, which you may not have heard of if you're not involved in the health space. There are various mandatory adverse event reporting systems, and actually not just in the medical field. There's also, I think, one of the most well-respected one is in aviation. They even have a culture. They've even developed a culture of reporting because they've built incentives to do so. Right, you can do it anonymously because, of course, people fear retaliation if they have to report with identifying themselves. Now we have a bit of difficulty in this in the medical field because of medical malpractice, but I think there's something we need to explore here in general in AI, right? We do have some AI incident databases out there, but they're all voluntary reporting. So it's something we need to explore. And I think third is that the oversight needs to be from a structurally independent body. Sometimes the IRBs are placed within the institution that's doing the research, right? So that you can see all kinds of conflict of interest there. Whether it's, it could be just pure institutional loyalty, or it could be something, a little bit more nefarious, if you will. We need these similar AI ethics boards inside the tech companies, or I'm not inside the tech companies, outside. Already we've seen retaliation against leaders of responsible AI within the tech companies. They've been outright fired. I can name names, but you also probably have heard of them. So yeah, I think those three: prior review to prevent harm before it happens, adverse event reporting, which catches the harm when it does happen, and structural independence, that ensures both of these mechanisms have teeth rather than becoming just compliance theater. So that's what I would recommend.
And you mentioned the IRBs, and they have had a great, a very responsible role, but they are imperfect in different ways. So they're being criticized for being slow, it's conservative, and sometimes captured by the institutional interests. You said something about that, and in the pace that we're moving in. So, what should AI take from them, and what should we leave behind?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a valid criticism. And we're all always, these processes are always trying to be improved upon. I think some things to keep would be the prior review process. And, we're already seeing calls for that in the various AI, ethics governance communities about having that prior review before even starting to develop the AI. Ask, why do we want to use AI in this way, or applied to XYZ problem? Ask the questions why before you even get started. And so this kinds of prior review, from the beginning of the design, the concept question, then the design question, and of course throughout the development process, should happen. The independence, as I was mentioning, let's not only have the AI developers as part of the review process, but have the community voice, right? Community members who are let's say the target user community, if you will, as a part of this independent review process. It needs to be multidisciplinary, right? We all have our blinders on. We only know what we know. So there should be, whether it's cultural anthropologists, philosophers, or others who come at it with a different lens, who can prod your thinking and poke at and challenge your thinking. And then we're seeing another thing to keep, which we're seeing in the EU AI Act, is the risk tiering. Right, not everything is the same risk. So again, and the IRBs have a similar kind of a risk tiering. So let's keep that. There's perhaps some things some things I question. I think some things are maybe, again, just to prevent compliance theater. Let's look a little bit at the check boxes or checklists. I think they're, for someone brand new, like for someone new to this field, as I'm fairly new, just exploring in the last several years. They're helpful because you can't think of every question to ask.
Yeah.
But I think the issue is that maybe people are thinking those are the only questions to ask. And it's not enough to just complete the process, right? I did the checklist. No, we need to measure the outcomes. The ultimate outcome, right? Is the AI actually solving the problem? Is it actually, is it solving the harm? I'm solving the problem, but with a minimal harm. Again, we have to watch out for that institutional capture. Self-regulation is not a good idea, right? What's the foxes in the hen house, right? We want to avoid that. And we have to think hard about the consent. Now, the IRBs, they all say that, have you, acquired, have you, informed all the research subjects? Have you collected their consent? Has it been done in their language of choice? Right? All these issues that have come up with these, informed consent with an X as a signature. Right? The people have found out the weaknesses in the informed consent process, like that led to some of these horrific cases. So we now with AI, right, there's no way you're going to get 1 million pieces of informed consent when it's unleashed on the world, right? Or billions of people using the system. So we have to think about this. It goes beyond consent, right? It's about human rights. So we have to really think about that beyond just the consent.
So lots of food for thought here, and let's move on to the global scale, because the AI governance conversations get most attention, are really happening in places like Washington, Brussels, London, Beijing. What gets left out when the global south is not in the room?
Yes, I mean, they obviously I mean, that's been the state of things all through time, through our, past, what, I don't know how many, what do we want to say, 400 or 500 years of history, the colonial system that still exists, even though we don't have colonies as such, most of the world, we still have colonial structures in place, colonial ways of thinking. So the Western concepts, dominate the discourse on AI policy and ethics, and they're kind of treated as, well, of course, there's one definition of ethics, right? It seems like everyone wants to, I mean, everyone wants to be ethical, and everyone thinks there is that it's sort of obvious what is ethical, that it's universally understood. But in fact, there are other concepts from Africa, from Asia. Um, the concept of Ubuntu, which is more about, you are a member of a community.
Mhm.
You are, your well-being is tied to the community well-being. And it's not about the Western, um, I guess, structure or social idea of individualism. Um, and and so if we rely on these Western ideas only, then we are reinforcing the old hierarchies of Western thought, right?
Yeah.
Western thought. I mean, look at how universities are structured, how legal systems are structured. They're based on how the West, the global North, structured it. Um, so we don't want to rely only on Western ideals. They're not the only valid ideal to base AI governance and policy on. And but when we do this, then we force the global South to have to adapt, right, to standards that aren't uh, um, they aren't compatible, if you will, that just don't feel second nature to
Mm.
them, that just don't align with their culture, with their society, and it's again just reinforcing those old hierarchies.
Yeah.
So yeah, and of course it won't work for the lived realities or the priorities of the global South communities.
Mm.
Yeah, Alice, I really appreciate you bringing this up. Actually, in the late '90s, I worked in Southern Africa in the height of HIV, and so what you're saying a lot about imposing cultural norms on another culture, that really resonates actually with me. And I know that you've seen your share. I've seen my share of health interventions that were designed with good intentions, but just didn't land quite well. And I'd like you to speak a little bit about any digital health interventions that initially had good intentions, but didn't wind up working for the communities they were meant to serve. So,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of common mistakes, what is a common mistake, and how is AI governance making this kind of similar mistake too?
Yeah, it's one common mistake I remember hearing about actually from someone who worked in the U.S. government was actually during the HIV/AIDS crisis. That it was such a crisis that when the digital health interventions started emerging, right, whether they were community health worker solutions or disease surveillance solutions, um, they let 1,000 flowers bloom was the phrase, because like basically like throw everything at the wall and see what sticks in a way, right? But but that meant that we had a lot of overlapping duplicative solutions out there that didn't share data. There were, and so that was the problem, right? They were trying to solve a problem, but they were creating a new problem.
Mm.
Um, and so there's a lack of that systemic approach, which has been the last decade or more. There's been a lot of work to combat that, to explain to government leaders about interoperability, about enterprise architecture. But instead of an enterprise being a corporation, the enterprise is the country, right? To tie together the entire public health system instead of each,
Yeah.
you know, district, each catchment area having its own solution, and none of it sharing data with each other, of course. And then also in terms of thinking systemically about funding it to be sustainable, right? Again, it'd be, oh, you got a 2, 3, 4 year grant and the money runs out and the system dies because it has no one to maintain it, because nobody to pay the salaries, to pay the software licenses, the hosting fees or internet costs and what have you. So we're still, working on this issue. How do we come up with sustainable business models? How do we? How does aid, which of course has been greatly reduced, but how does aid still work more responsibly in this to foster startups and have locally grown, built, sustained solutions rather than solutions that can't be maintained after the funding ends? Um, with AI governance, there's probably some parallels. I think maybe the same idea in the sense of the local ownership and local leadership of digital health solutions. The same idea also is being called for in AI, but in the case of involving civil society and I think as a proxy for communities and citizens. All the whatever organizations can represent the communities, to make sure that they are involved, like as I mentioned, at the whether it's an RB like process or something like that's in an AI ethics committee or what have you, that is involved in making decisions about uh, which AI solutions to build, how are they designed, how are they deployed, how are they monitored, um, and tracked if there are adverse events. So they need to have meaningful representation and involvement, not just serve as tokens so they can tick the box and say we have um, local community representation.
Mm. So, local ownership and local leadership has come up in our previous conversations as well. Again, as something that's crucial. So, according to you, Alice, what does that look like in practice when we look at AI governance? Not just as a slogan, but something that, yeah, really works.
Well, let's see. I'm not sure if I can say it really works yet. I think the field is so new,
Might work.
but what's that?
That's something that might work,
Yeah, it might work.
has that
Um,
potential of working. Yeah.
all right. Well, I would say that in any kind of AI governance body, um, whether it's an international, and there are several international AI governance bodies now, or whether it's within a corporation, a company that is producing and selling a product, um, that as I mentioned, there needs to be that meaningful representation of the members of the community, whether it's members from low and
Mhm.
middle income countries or it's an underserved population in the U.S. If it's the rural-urban divide, there's a lot of different populations that are underrepresented and more vulnerable. And when I say meaningful representation, I mean like they are actually in officer roles that have decision-making authority or influence, such as the chair and co-chairs. I mean, having co-chairs, for instance, that they're the leaders of subcommittees, they have authorship in whatever reports come out. And of course, they have to be in the actual membership of these bodies as well. They shouldn't be just consulted. They should be actually making the decisions, setting the standards, and leading the way. Um, um, we have also, I think there are some ways to have, there may be ways to have like external, in terms of having something with teeth, external forces or external bodies that mandate something. Like in the US, for instance, there's actually some ways where even without legislation, you might be able to have something with teeth. So the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, they have leverage through their conditions of participation. For instance, hospitals and health systems must meet CMS requirements to participate in the Medicare and Medicaid insurance, and reimbursement system. So that is effectively a mandate for almost every health institution in the U.S. So they could, again, I don't know what they're actually working on, but I'm thinking they could probably require that hospitals and health systems document their AI governance processes. Which processes are they using? What are the outputs of these internal AI governance findings? They have to include who is a member of these governance bodies. Are they members of the target population? Do these members serve in any critical roles on the governance body? Theoretically, that could be done, and I have not researched if that is actually happening, but there may be other methods. So we do need to figure out where we can use mechanisms that are already in place, as well as what new mechanisms are needed.
Thank you.
Oh, I should mention AI liability insurance is also a recent exploration. So insurance companies could also incentivize this equitable and effective and meaningful AI governance by requiring companies to also prove and demonstrate and prove how their AI governance is working within their organization.
So we're coming to almost the end of our conversation here, and I think you've mentioned a few of these things, but I like to I like to always look at, while we're looking at the more cautionary tales and things that we should watch out for, I also like to look at, what would happen if we got this right. So, in your opinion, if AI governance genuinely adopted, the best of some of the health ethics infrastructure, what would be different about how AI products reach people in the next 5 years, in your opinion?
Well, there would be trust. I mean, that's what it ultimately comes down to, right? If people will not trust AI, if it keeps hallucinating, if it makes mistakes, if it comes out with weird results, like that early case in the New York Times reporter who said the chatbot was trying to encourage him to leave his wife. If it comes all these weird and wrong results, right? There's no trust if it keeps doing this. So if we hopefully with some of the ideas I've shared, and I'm sure there are others, there would be trust in these systems. And therefore the adoption would take off. Because, there are so many potential benefits of AI in health, especially, right? In terms of no one has time to read probably the millions of pages of health research to find out that there is a possibility that this is the disease that somebody has because it matches their symptoms. And AI is very good at that right now. All right, as it's pretty much ingested everything that is available off the internet. And it has actually. There are cases. I was listening to the New England Journal of Medicine's AI Grand Rounds podcast, and they interviewed somebody who with interviewed her, I think the mother and the doctor, the mother who found the ultimate the what ultimately ended up being the disease that her daughter was experiencing through an intensive use of ChatGPT, and she had gone through several doctors. So years and years of frustration. So AI really has potential, and it already is shown to be more accurate than the medical professionals in scanning diagnostic images and detecting, I think, different cancers. And so there is promise, but there's, we know that there are the mistakes. So, like for instance, I mentioned the aviation safety process, where you can anonymously report, you are protected actually from punishment. So, and we all feel very safe flying planes because of this culture that's been built over decades of reporting problems and the extensive amount of safety checking in the building of airplanes, training of pilots. So that maybe that's the gold standard, to achieve that level of trust in AI. If we achieve the same level of trust in flying around the world.
I love that you end with this promising perspective. So that there's work to do to get there, but there is so much potential. And then the last question for you, Alice: what is the question you are still trying to answer?
Oh, yes. I think we're all trying to answer, and of course, it's like, how do we develop AI governance that can flex and adapt with the rapid advancements in AI? How can we have fixed legislative processes that take time and for a reason, but it's obviously too slow for AI. So how do we come up with something more nimble but yet just as effective as legislation and other regulatory processes? And I guess kind of along that same vein, how can we design AI governance so that there are incentives to participate instead of seeing AI governance as a hindrance, as an obstacle? I think that there are cases, again, of other regulations that have fostered innovation, that have, so I think we have to find how to do the same in AI governance.
Well, thank you for joining us today, Alice.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and I'm glad this gave me the opportunity to explore this topic with you.
Thank you. It was very interesting. So thank you, everyone. You've been listening to Between Us and the Machine. That's it for today. Thanks for being part of this conversation.
Subscribe wherever you listen and share this with someone who should hear it.
This is Between Us
and the Machine.